Hey everybody, it's Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com here in San Diego, California. So for all things Vespa, whether you got a modern Vespa or you have a vintage Vespa that you're restoring, we got you covered on our web store, ScooterWest.com. So today I'm going to show you many ways that you can set up a stand to service a vintage Vespa without the professional tools like having a workshop scissor lift. You know, in my own personal workshop, I have 4 large electro-hydraulic scissor lifts for doing service, and they're used daily by all my technicians and myself. But maybe you're a home mechanic and you need to find a better way to service your Vespa, you know, on a lot of items that you can't do when it's just on the center stand. So I'm going to show you a combination of using the Vespa Motorsport and Scooter West scissor lift alone. I'm going to show you using the scissor lift in conjunction with the wooden chock. And you can look at my prior video on how to build this whole wooden chock. Real simple to build with just basic carpentry tools and a little bit of hardware and minimal amount of wood, you know, from the hardware store to build something like that. So let's get right to it. I'll show you how this will go. So here I'm going to just show some basic uses of the scissor jack. Part number on the Scooter West web store is tool jack. We have these available, and essentially it's just a scissor jack that's compact size. Put a 22mm socket. You don't necessarily need to have a power ratchet like this, but a regular hand tool will do it. And see, it goes way up there. You know, for various operations. Lifting the motor, lifting the frame, typically is what you use a jack like this for. The most basic services, oftentimes maybe you'll pull the rear tire, you want to drain the gearbox oil on your vintage Vespa. With the scooter on the center stand, you can just lift it just a little bit. You got to take extra caution, because if you lift the scooter too high, we get past the fulcrum point of the center stand, and guess what? The center stand snaps up, and you might have a scooter that's going to fall over on you. So let me show you how that's done without tipping the scooter here. So right in the very tail of a vintage Vespa, where you'd have the license plate typically mounted, you could usually put the jack right at the edge right here, and you can just lift it a little bit. And see, at this point, the tire spins off. If you go too much higher, you get to a point where that center stand's going to be straight up and down, and it's going to flip up. But probably go a little bit higher. You know, get the tire about 2 inch or 2 inches off the ground, no problems right there. So that's one way to use it. And the one thing is, if you're changing a tire, sometimes the stand will be in the way, so you could kind of also get it right underneath this section of your motor casting right here. You know, this motor is partly dismantled at this point, and pretty much do the same thing. And at this point, I have access to the tire, and it's nice and stable. It's not going anywhere. You can unbolt the tire, do a tire job. You could get up in there and do the clutch. Ideally, you would jack it from the rear of the frame. You'd pull your shock bolt out, and you could drop the motor down. That's another use. So right now we have a shock bolt loose because we're actively working on this. So get the, typically you pull the wheel out of the way to do a clutch job on a Vespa. You can pull the shock bolt out, the lower shock bolt on a large frame Vespa. You do the same with the small frame. And you can see, as I jack it up, watch that center stand, watch the front tire, because right when those kind of pass the point, but you can see the motor's dropping down, and that gives you more access to the clutch cover, on a vintage Vespa. And you could also change out the rear shock if you have the tank pulled out. Many applications where you'd want to jack it up like this, and then just get the hole to line up. We put the bolt right there. Pretty nice to do when you're just doing a one-man service. Don't have somebody else to help you. So maybe you need to service the scooter with the center stand flipped up, or you want to service the front end. Maybe you need to change the center stand. So this would be an ideal setup to support the center of the scooter frame. You'd want just a basic tie down strap, like something like this. And the only reason I'm doing something, is you want to tie the jack to the scooter so it doesn't topple over. I mean, it's possible sometimes to support it carefully, but for instance, you'll find a nice flat part of the frame, and there's these kind of cross members across the frame. And this jack is wide enough to act as a stand so the scooter won't tip over. Get your tie down around the scooter. Depending on the condition of the scooter, maybe you want to put some rags, a big blanket around the whole scooter. You can put the ratchet right across the center mat of the scooter. That would be a safe spot where you won't scratch anything that's painted. And you can kind of see it's kind of pulling the jack up right now. But at this point, I'll be able to lift the scooter. It's going to snap off the center stand, and it will still be supported. So you can see it's lifting the front end of the scooter. And now the center stand's popped up. And for instance, you got the weight of the motor that's kind of keeping the rear of the scooter down. And you're able to lift it quite high. And this would be a perfect setup if you need to drop the fork out of the scooter. Once you take the tire off the scooter, maybe you have this over a curb or some little step. You could slide it around a little bit. It's nice and stable, but we could pull the front end of the scooter out to service the front end. Or alternatively, if you need to replace the center stand, this is a perfect setup for doing that sort of work. And if you're going to want to put it back on the stand, just have the stand, just hold it in place, and as you drop your lift, you can and once it touches down, it's nice and safe and back on the center stand here. So you built yourself a chock for the front tire of your scooter. Pretty much you just wheel it right in, have your tie downs all ready to go, along with a canyon dancer. It's very helpful. Get this all tied down. And the way the canyon dancer works, I see a lot of people, they don't use them right, but the webbing goes through each one of these little cups, or if you have the older style, it goes through the nylon tubes. So get the tie downs hooked onto each one of these loops here. And of course, if you had a helper help you tie down, it's going to go a lot easier. And now that the front is chalked up, the idea here is you're able to service the center stand. We're able to lift the scooter frame to pull the motor out. Works pretty good with the vintage bike, for doing any sort of service. Say, for instance, you want to pull the motor out. I'll show you how that's done. So you do have to be careful with the balance points. So if you're going to be lifting the scooter from the center with your scissor jack, I would highly recommend putting some cinder blocks, big rocks, or some weights from a weightlifting set on both of these wings of this platform here, just to keep some weight. Because if you lift it in the center, it's just going to lift the front end up, and the scooter is likely going to topple over. If you're jacking it from the very rear of the frame, typically you're not going to have an issue because it's kind of going to balance the scooter very well. So I'll show you how that's done. So you can see we have the motor quite prepared to be pulled out. Pretty much all the cables, control cables, fuel line, even the airbox is very nice not to have the airbox in the way. So you can jack up the scooter a little bit, and you can pull out your shock bolt right here. The motor's already dropping down. And at this point, you could keep on jacking the scooter up if you want to pivot the motor down. For instance, if you're going to service the clutch. And this is a perfect setup if you want to service the clutch or split the motor while it's still in the scooter frame, or need to change out the rear shock. Very stable, no issues. The front end's all chalked up. For instance, you want to pull the motor out. You got your pivot bolt out, and you want to get a vice grip. Maybe you want to have two people, somebody supporting the motor as you're also pulling the bolt out. So before you pull the motor out, the main engine pivot bolt, you want to pull the nut off, and it usually has a split washer as well. And have a vice grip on your bolt. You're gonna have to kick the stand down, and just be prepared for the motor to drop. You know, this motor's already pretty light because it's has most of the guts pulled out. At this point, you easily get the motor out of the way, get your cables. You unbolt the selector box, no problem. And with even the tire on there, you're able to just wheel the motor right out and service the motor. For instance, you're going to rebuild it. It's possible to have the air box bolted to the scooter motor, just however you want to do it. It's just a little easier to get the motor in and out when you don't have the air box bolted to it. So put the motor back in. I'm just doing it by myself. Of course, if you have two people to help you, it's going to be a lot easier than, you know, struggling with the cables. But you kind of want to get the tire past the shock here. Get your cables out of the way. And pretty much shift it and get the bolt back in place. And you may have somebody look at the other side, make sure everything's all lined up. Get the bolt in place, and you could either just lift the motor, get the rear shock bolt in place, and at this point you can start putting everything back together. So kind of a perfect example of how to use a lift like this. And, you know, hook up the wiring, all your control cables, and so on. So thanks for watching. I hope you found all these tips useful if you're going to service your vintage Vespa at home. Several different ways to use both the scissor jack or the scissor jack in conjunction with a home-built wheel chock. You don't need to have a professional lift in your home garage. Oftentimes you may not have room for such a large lift, or the budget. Some of those lifts cost as much as a scooter for a decent quality one. This is a perfect setup to do everything you need to do on a vintage Vespa. From a full frame off restoration, the pair of these tools will be ideal for doing all the work at home. Another tip you could use is maybe you're building a scooter. It may take 2 or 3 people to help you out, but you could do this whole entire setup on top of a workbench. So you're standing up and working on the scooter, or sitting in a chair versus working on the ground. So keep that in mind. Sometimes if you're doing a long-term project, it's worth a little bit of extra effort just to get the scooter up high where it's easy to work on, you know, at pretty much chest level. So another little tip, but thanks for watching. And until next time, it's the Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and Scooter West here in San Diego, California. And the way you can support this channel is just purchase products from us at Scooter West. Whether you got a vintage Vespa or a modern Vespa. If you're looking for a new scooter, we got a dealership here in San Diego as well. And I run a service department. If you want a vintage Vespa serviced, I'm really sorry. Right now we're quite backed up. Till next time, Robot here.